We're going to flip some things around. We were going to have Reg, we're going to have Katrina. And I first met Katrina, well, she works for Jumpstart Lab. And they do training, and also known for having Steve Klabnik on their roster of trainers. So there's a gets to a point. No, I was about to say, damn it. What I was about to say was probably going to be dismissive to Katrina because of Steve. I should just talk about her. I've seen Katrina speak many times on both training and introductory topics, but it's really when she starts to go that next step, once you've already know what you're doing and you're going to look at like code reviewing, that whole process of becoming a better developer. And if you get a chance to spend time with Katrina at all, and obviously we get to now, but if you can catch up with her and spend quality time with her, you're going to learn an absolute treat of an amount of things to learn. So please put your hands together for Katrina Owen.
Some bugs lure me in. I forget to eat. I have trouble sleeping. It's an adventure. Bugs like these consume me. It's exciting and stimulating, and when I figure out the devious ways in which they're causing the system to fail, I feel victorious. Princess 1, Dragon 0. This particular bug was the other kind of bug, the mind-numbingly boring kind, the kind that causes all the other items on my to-do list to seem suddenly urgent. Surely, I can't fix this bug right now. I have a toilet to scrub. The bug was in an application whose sole purpose was to allow villagers, actual flesh and blood villagers, to post gossip on the web. So who got hitched, who had a baby, who has a birthday coming up, and the gossip would then get piped straight into the production system of the local village rag, where it would be printed on actual paper next to the story of the largest fish to be caught off the dock since 1962. So the broken feature was the feature that when Alice posts a picture of her new baby, allows Bob to tell everyone that they should come gossip about it. In other words, the broken feature was being able to gossip about the gossip. The strategy I chose to solve this problem was to fix it as fast as I could without reading the code. So the full bug report read as follows. I tried to share by email, but nothing happened. I opened up the application, put in my email address, clicked the button, and lo and behold, the villager was right. Nothing happened. So I activated the JavaScript console and tried again, and got a 500 error. And the JavaScript was trying to make an asynchronous call to an endpoint inside the application, and what I got back in the little debugging window was a wall of text formatted as HTML. So copied out the call with all the parameters, so I could call the endpoint using curl, so that I could redirect the output into a file so that I could open it in the browser. And the stack trace was 1 line long. The execution hadn't even reached the controller action. Some before filter blew up trying to send a message to nil. And so a quick investigation revealed that the before filter was completely irrelevant to encouraging gossip. And so the solution was just to bypass it altogether. And so now, I was expecting to get a 200 OK, a snippet of JSON, and an email. And instead, I got another stack trace. And this time, the code managed to get all the way to the email template before it blew up in something to do with translations. And the stack trace drew out the entire feature. It starts in the controller in a method with the outrageous name share by email or SMS. This calls out to a module called sharing, which has a method called send to recipients, which presumably is a collective term for both phone numbers and email addresses. And the next stop in the stack trace is send to email in the same module. And this further delegates on down to an action mailer, which sends an email using a text template, which is internationalized and interpolates strings from a locale file. Now, the error page helpfully displayed the exact line of code which was causing the problem. And the internationalization thing is some fancy string interpolation, and it takes 4 arguments, and the ERB template was sending in only 3 of them. So by matching up the keys in the error message, it was pretty straightforward to determine that the missing key was tidbit sender. So I patched the template, kicked off the email, and at this point, I did get back a proper response. Also, the email arrived in my inbox. So my work here is done. Management would be impressed. You know, heroic save and all that. And the truth is, I did what the French call le minimum syndical. So this is a term that mocks the bare minimum. It makes fun of bureaucracy for setting standards that are so low that you could literally not do worse, because at that point you wouldn't have done it at all. And having fixed this bug, I was sorely tempted to tiptoe quietly away. But I know that if there are more bugs in the future, I'm the one who's going to fix them. Now, having said that, I'm not going to get a bad reputation if I tiptoe away. Nobody's going to know. Like, my name isn't even in the commit history for the feature, right? I just touched 2 lines. So I wouldn't be accused of negligence, but I was still unable to turn my back on this code. And I would love to pretend that this is because I am a good person, right? I'm a morally superior being, and I would be lying. Because I am driven by fear. The code might be decent, or it could be a stinking quagmire of rot and decay. And without at least glancing at it, I can't know. I fear stinking quagmires of rot and decay. I dread getting sucked into them and being thigh-high in mud and leeches and wrangling Boolean gates with one hand and fighting off stack traces with the other. And the last thing I want to do is wade into the swamp. But I fear that it's going to cause me X hours of pain. Let's say 3 hours of pain. So if this thing blows up in my face at 2:45 a.m. one night, then I am very likely to spend those 3 hours and get it wrong, causing me 3 to 4 days of mopping up and hell and pain, writing scripts to parse access logs so that I can put lost orders back in the database, hypothetically. It's this fear that motivated me to take one tiny step, to eyeball the code and just look at it, make an evaluation about how likely it is to blow up at a really inconvenient point in time. So before we look at the code, I'd like to take a moment to talk about the tests. Moving on. So in the controller, in the share by email or SMS action, there's one thing that caught my eye, and it was a constant that I had never seen before: tiny URL. So it wasn't present in the stack trace. The email that I received did not contain a shortened URL. And the logical explanation for this is that this is relevant only to the SMS portion of the feature. And it is true that we are building up a text message right here in the controller on every request, whether or not we've received any telephone numbers to send the SMS to. However, the text message does not contain a shortened URL either. In fact, once we've generated the shortened URL and assigned it to this local variable, that variable is never referenced again. So let me show you the tiny URL module. Actually, let's have the comments in the module tell us a little bit about the code. We have a base exception class. We have an exception class. And incidentally, the only thing that the base exception class is used for is to define this exception class, which in turn is used exactly once. Now, this is a little bit cryptic, but the method name does a good job of explaining the comment. This is both cryptic and misspelled, but again, the method name explains what's going on. And enough about comments. Let's look at some code. This is the core piece of logic in tinyURL. And you don't have to read the code. Just notice that we're calling out to an external service over HTTP. Every time we call the share by email or SMS endpoint in our application, we call out over HTTP to an external service and throw the result away. Now, the author of this code has thoughtfully added caching, so we might not actually make the call on every single request. And besides, it only happens in staging and production. Now, you'll notice that the case statement always returns. Therefore, the last line of the method will never be reached. Also, you can see that the case statement has exactly two outcomes, true and false. We have simpler means of achieving the same result. And the caching mechanism manages to use both a module variable and a module instance variable in the same breath. Yeah. So it turns out that the tinyURL module is not used by any code anywhere ever, and it can safely be deleted. So the code has been racking up expletive points pretty quickly. Now, expletive points, or expletive points for the Americans in the room, they're also known as XP. They're an equivalent measure to WTFs per minute. So we found 2 bugs where we were expecting only 1. Bugs congregate. There's dead code. There's a gratuitous case statement. The code uses a module variable. The code uses a module instance variable. The comments either state the obvious or are incoherent. We're building a text message even when we're only sending emails. The entry point into the feature is a method called share by email or SMS. So the method apparently does 2 things that are so unrelated that we can't even use and in the method name. There are no tests. The code is calling out over HTTP on every request and never using the result. We've accumulated 62 expletive points, but wait, there's more. There's an unless else being used to determine the response for this action. It's switching on a flag called invalid name, giving us a double negative for the happy path. The invalid name flag itself is actually kind of spectacular. Name must not exceed 40 characters. The significance of the number 40 is unknown. Out of curiosity, I kicked off the curl command with an invalid name. I got a reasonable error message and an email. So the process goes like this. Having determined that the name is invalid, we send out the emails and the text messages, and then we return an HTTP 400 bad request. You'll notice that nil is legit. So it seems likely that if we hit the controller action with a name without a name, we'd probably get an email. Instead, we get a 400 bad request. And the error message tells us that they've already been told. Obviously. Now, it turns out we don't get an email because the send to recipients method has a guard clause against a nil name. So let's look at what else that one has to offer. In the sharing module, the send to recipients method is very complicated looking, and it has a comment that explains what the method does. Now, unfortunately, every single part of that comment is wrong. There's no message key. The hash key is called SMS. There's no email recipients key. It's just email. And there's no SMS recipients key. It's called numbers. And you'd think that it can't be more wrong, but it is. Even if all the keys were named correctly in the comment is still wrong because the message that gets built up and sent in via params doesn't actually get sent to emails because we have an ERB template that the action mailer uses to do that. So the lesson is delete comments that restate the implementation. All right, so the method has code to clean up the text message. That code never gets called because the params hash never has a message key. Then it cleans up the name, and this is reasonable, of course, aside from the fact that the controller validated that the name was less than 40 characters, and now it might be shorter and therefore valid. Having cleaned up the name, it could now be validated again, this time with a cutoff of 41. Once we've gotten past all the validation and cleanup, we get to this code. So let's break this down. We combine emails and telephone numbers that came in separately into a single array. Then we iterate over the whole lot and use regexes in order to figure out whether we have a phone number a phone number and email so that we can send it off using the correct protocol. So at the very core of this block, we have two methods. We have send to email and send to SMS. And we'll look at the send to email first. According to the comment, send to email sends email. This is only partially correct. We may or may not actually send the email, and this is really confusing, so I'm going to break it down. Alice posts a picture of her new baby. Bob goes to the website and enters Charlie's email address to tell him about it. So the tidbit was created by Alice. If we don't have her email address, we'll skip blithely past the bit where we're actually dispatching the email to Charlie, whose address we happen to have because Bob gave it to us. Now, it's very likely that we don't have Alice's email address because people sign up for this application using their cell phones. If they don't have their password, if they forget their password, we send them an SMS, not an email. So we might have her email address, but we probably don't. Now, we prefer to report good news always. Remember this block of code? I actually simplified it so I could fit it on the slide. Besides, I was worried about being able to explain it to you. Originally, it looked more like this. So returning true here ultimately causes us to tell Bob that Charlie got the email, regardless of what actually happened. And then in the other branch of the conditional, we send the send to SMS message, which, according to the comment, sends SMS. You know the saying, lies, damn lies, and comments. So, what does this code say about the developer who wrote it? Well, it's easy to criticize. Fun, too. It's tempting to believe that whoever wrote this code is an idiot, or a bad developer, or at the very least, a bad person. This is known as the fundamental attribution error. When somebody writes terrible code, we make assumptions about why that is. Right? At one end of the scale, we attribute bad code to individual traits, to their characteristics. They're not skilled enough, or they don't care enough. And at the other end of the scale, we assume that it's situational. It's a momentary lapse due to contextual pressures. So on one end of the scale, they're a bad person. The other end of the scale, they're having a bad day. And the forces that push us around from moment to moment are invisible. Like, we feel them. They're obvious. You know, we're in the thick of things. We can't help but notice them. But they're hard to observe from the outside. And the farther you are from the situation, the harder it is to imagine them. And the result is that people we don't know are bad developers, whereas we and our friends are having a bad day. So what happened? What happened with share by email or SMS? How does a smart, experienced developer like the author of this code end up with a mess like that? Surely they didn't sit down one morning and write the feature from one end to the other, finishing off with a flourish. Most likely, what happened to them is what happens to all of us. Pressure, rapidly changing requirements, corners that get cut. And even without it being a rush job, the situation here was not ideal. For one, this developer wasn't usually on the project. This was my project, me and one other guy. So it was an unfamiliar code base. Also, the code base itself was far from exemplary. This is not the code base you'd love to inherit. And then again, who knows? Maybe there was no deadline. Maybe this person was intimately familiar with the code base. Maybe they were just bored or drunk, or maybe their cat died. If you strip away all of the fuzzy, mushy, muddled humanity of it all, you get down to a really interesting equation that's based purely on rational choices. So imagine a scenario where player 1 and player 2 may either cooperate or defect. If both players choose to cooperate, they both get 3 points, right? A mutual reward. If both players choose to defect, they get 1 point each, mutual punishment. If player 1 cooperates and player 2 defects, then player 2 gets 5 points, known as the temptation, and player 1 gets 0 points, known as the sucker's payoff. So in terms of software, cooperating means coding with care, whatever that means to you and your team. And that may be taking the time to write tests, or writing a short method, or giving that method an expressive name. Defecting is not doing those things. Right? Defecting is committing with no thought to the next developer who's going to be reading it. So here's the thing. If player 1 knows that player 2 is going to defect, then it's in their best interest to defect as well. Both players get 1 point. And on the other hand, if player 1 knows that player 2 is going to cooperate, then it is in their best interest to defect, because they'll get 5 points, and player 2 will get none. So the rational choice in every case is to defect. Yet by doing so, everybody loses. So notice that this is not a zero-sum game. The total number of points possible is 6 for a single round. And the only way you can get that is by cooperating. If everyone looks out for themselves, nobody wins. Defection is the only rational choice in a one-round game, or in a game where there are a fixed number of rounds. But it is not the choice if you're going to play an unlimited number, an unknown number of rounds against another person. The dynamics change completely. So in that type of scenario, if you defect, the other player can defect in retaliation on the next turn. So the rational strategy in that situation is to cooperate at first until the other player defects, at which point you should retaliate immediately. If they back down when you retaliate, forgive them completely. Don't hold a grudge. Start cooperating and keep cooperating as quickly as possible. So this is Game Theory 101. Notice that the best strategy is not always cooperate. Game theory suggests that you should be nice. Now, they have a very particular definition of nice. Nice means don't shoot first. Doesn't mean be a pushover. So if the other player never defects, it's all good. Everybody wins. There's a great book that talks about a lot of the research about this. The bunch of really interesting research was done at the end of the 70s, the beginning of the 80s. And the book is called The Evolution of Cooperation. And it's awesome for a lot of reasons, but there are two in particular that I really like. First, it's about computer programs that are pitted against each other in a grand tournament. Second, science. So, I'm making software development out to sound like some cold, heartless game where we developers compete against each other, which is ludicrous. The problem is sometimes we behave as though it were. This cold, heartless scenario maps shockingly well to the costs that we often pay in order to deliver software. So when everyone on the team cooperates, everyone looks good. Everyone can be productive. If one person on the team consistently defects, that person looks great. They're ticking off features on the backlog, they're fixing bug after bug after bug, many of which they introduced in the previous fix. They're productive. They deliver all sorts of heroic saves. They do it over and over and over again, quickly and reliably. And the rest of the team slows down, trying to understand what code that person is writing, shoring it up, having to rework it whenever they need to make changes. They add tests, they improve error handling, they extract responsibilities. And the time it takes them to make a change goes up. Now, if the whole team defects, there's an initial rush where features are delivered quickly. The bugs, even more so. We spend all the clean code that we stored up, but that clean code doesn't get regenerated. Then it all breaks down. We reach a point where each change takes longer and longer to make until we reach a pathetic but stable equilibrium where progress inches forward in an endless, painful struggle. Humans are biased towards cooperation. We're very likely to cooperate, even when it makes no rational sense to do so. Yet, in being irrational, we will also gleefully defect when it's not in our own self-interest. Sometimes it's just easier to not write those tests, not rename those variables. And we want to do the right thing, but how often do we slip? How often are we in a rush for no particular reason other than habit? How often are we tired or flustered or distracted and just think, we'll just commit, just this once. Move on with our day. Good intentions are meaningless. Every commit we make tips the balance very slightly in one direction or another, an inch towards entropy, an inch towards order. If most of the commits you make are shifting the balance towards increased order, no matter how slight that shift is, your code base will constantly improve. Perfection is unattainable, and ultimately, it's irrelevant. So I urge you to ask yourself before you commit, am I cooperating or am I defecting? Thank you.
According to game theory, it's a prisoner's dilemma. Do you think there are ways to change the game so it, besides being self-conscious when committing, to change that game for it to be a win-win no matter what? Maybe like peer code review or any other practices?
Yeah, so based on Sandy's talk yesterday, if you can not let the defectors in the first place, that will help. But we can't really do that most of the time. One of the outcomes of the research on the iterated version of the prisoner's dilemma is that the thing that will make people choose to cooperate more is if the future seems closer and larger. So if you cooperate more often and like sooner, higher frequency and soon, that will make it more likely that others will cooperate with you. And the interesting thing is that the retaliation doesn't have to be the same kind of retaliation that was the defection. Like, I write shit code, so now you're going to go and retaliate by writing shit code. We're not going to get anywhere. But if we use our social sort of peer pressure to as a retaliation, we do weekly code reviews, and instead of being all nice in the code review, we could actually pull up all the worst stuff and really be honest about it, and not in a mean way, just in an honest way. And so you know that if you're committing and you're tired, you know you're going to see your code on Friday. So it'll deter you a little bit. But then after that code review, you have to forgive completely. It's over. You can't be pulling that up a month later saying, yeah, well, that one time where you did the, 400-line controller, it's over. But I think that might help. Maybe.
Up the back, up the top, up the back.
Hi. Was that code actually real?
Yes. This was a real bug that I got asked to fix before dinner one day, and I ended up shaving yaks. Like I got it fixed really quickly, but I got so sucked into it that I think I actually spent like 10 hours rewriting the thing. I did an extraction because the code is proprietary. I did an extraction, sort of anonymizing and putting it in a tiny Sinatra app that's on my GitHub account under CSI Ruby. If you want to go have a look at it, it's all there.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask about this because, well, that's a good example of how not to do that.
Yes. Yes,
Cool, thank you.
Thanks, great talk. Was the code that well formatted?
He's still not back.
If the code was well formatted?
Yeah, on your slides, the code was very well formatted.
Unformatted.
Well formatted.
Oh, well formatted. In the real code base, I think the formatting was absolutely fine. There was no trailing white space. All the indentation was correct. I didn't see any glaring, horrible formatting in the original code.
Okay.
Hello. Lovely talk, thank you. So what I was thinking about was sort of surfacing this direction that the team's heading in. So, sometimes the team are under pressure and they're heading towards chaos. Sometimes the team are having a good day and they're heading towards, what's the opposite? Quality?
Order, I guess.
Order. What are some good ways to, so like the idea of an information radiator, something on the wall that gives the team feedback about what's going on. What are some ideas about how you can give the team that sense of generally, are we heading towards chaos or control and order?
Yeah, I use Code Climate for that. Sorry.
You need to give a more full answer and then...
Sounds like we need a new theme for Code Climate, the Dungeons & Dragons.
I don't know. Sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, I tried.
Does anyone else have ideas on the question? Not the question, but the answer.
Hello. So is there any takeout for, let's say, a leader of a group, someone who is able to somehow influence the payoff of the retaliating and like the different situation? Looks like so, right?
So that's a really interesting question. I think, if I understood it correctly, is there a way to, as a leader, influence the payoff and the cost? And if you look at some of the research around Sandy, something resource management, common resource management. So common pool resource management. So you've got the fisheries or the cattle grazing in a field. So if you have a resource and it gets regenerated at a certain rate, and people use it at a certain rate. And there's a lot of research on communities who have been in this situation and who have been able to do that, and communities who have not. And so some of the research around that has looked at what are the things that those who are doing it correctly do well. And one of the first things that comes up is that the people who are involved make the rules themselves, that they're not imposed by anyone else. So if the people who are actually committing the code can be a part of the decision-making process for figuring out what are the standards that we want to follow, and how are we going to, what sanctions do we want to have in place? I mean, are we going to have a pigs list where your name goes up if you've been committing bad code? Or, if you're a part of defining both the rules and the sanctions, that's very, very helpful. And there are a whole bunch of, I found a list of like 8 things, and I can only remember a couple of them.
Just to mention, the guy asked about some projects to help codes. There is a J metric foo. Maybe you can help him. Metric foo.
Metric foo, yes. So I believe that Code Climate also uses metric foo, and there are others. There's flog and flay and reach.
All of them are inside metric foo, actually.
Oh, awesome. Okay, even better.
You said...
Keep things on the show on the road. Go.
Yeah? I'm sorry. You said very interesting things, and very, I think it's right. When you said, think about the person who will touch this code after you. But, you know, this is the moment when you're, for example, not me, but you're an advanced person who uses Ruby very well, and you know, a lot of abstractions, patterns, and maybe, I don't know, monads or something like that. And there is a case when you can solve this problem elegantly with high abstraction or advanced thing. For example, me and my colleague always have this argue when I want to use observer, and he wants to call, just to explicitly call the thing. And well, it's always like, well, observers are very implicit, but maybe sometimes it's better to use observer because when you need to, you know, put some, maybe not to pull explicitly, state the calls of every, I don't know, maybe you have some handlers, 3 handlers, 4 handlers. And how do I decide? And then the newbie comes here and he can't understand anything in my code because he do not know about observer at all. So how do I decide whether I should use some explicit stuff, some basic stuff, or maybe monads?
Right. I'm not sure if that was a lot of questions or one question. I'm going to try to answer the...
All you've got to do, Katrina, is answer longer than it took him to ask the question.
Put me on
5
the spot
minutes,
here.
go.
It's a lightning talk, right? Okay, so David in the previous talk was saying that readability is context-driven, right? It's dependent on the context, and part of the context is how much experience you have. And if you know that you're working on a team with many people who are inexperienced, it's probably a good idea to be more concrete, right? Go to the concrete end of things rather than to the abstract end of things. But not all the way. I think it's very important to pair with people. If there are things that you find important in order to keep the code base manageable and malleable, I think it's important to pair with that other person to help them understand the patterns that you're using. But I would definitely say that readability, like the choices that you make will depend on who is the reader, who the reader is.
Okay, and a little bit more, I'm sorry. Should I be aware of, you know, some other person who are not on the team yet, but may come, or it's like over engineering or overdoing?
Yeah, no. No, I don't think you should. Like so here's the thing. I see a lot of, in my daily work, I see a lot of people saying, you should refactor this to use that because of something possibly in the future. And I'm like, no. You know, I'm not really interested in that. I'm interested in, does the code express what it intends now? Are there code smells that we can refactor? Like, we can extract a class because we're seeing something in the code that says that there's a class here. We're not going to extract a class because we might need a class in the future. If we need a class in the future, we'll make a class in the future. So I think a lot of the reasons that we end up doing refactorings, we explain them with... Oh, sorry. We explain them by saying, oh, we need to be able to change it in the future, but I'd rather that we look more to the present and say, how can we right now make it as clear and as expressive and as readable as possible? I just made that longer than your question, so I win.
I'm sort of trying to wrap my head around the whole dichotomy between being a bad person and having a bad day, that sort of thing. And in the context of that source code that you showed, which I kind of appreciated it because it made me feel really smart in the same way that David's code made me feel really kind of stupid. So, because anyway, I think maybe there's another. It's not being a bad person to not have put the time in to have learned how to be a good craftsman, right? Isn't that sort of what was wrong with that code? Was just sort of a lack of craftsmanship?
So I know the programmer who wrote it. That person is actually a really, really smart person. And you can see that, right, from the regexes.
Right, true. Well, no, unless you just Googled them and copied them.
Right.
Right,
So,
which is pretty
so
possible.
I've seen this person write very good code, well-tested, expressive, like services that do a lot in 200 lines and are easy to, just one thing, but very well. And, this, I don't know what happened. When I got asked to fix the bug, I wasn't even sure what code, where, and I asked around who wrote the feature. Nobody remembered writing the feature. Like, even this person couldn't remember having written it. So, clearly something happened.
So you're saying that programmer has the capability to be a good craftsman, but
Yes.
wasn't on that occasion?
Yeah, it was definitely not there.
Is
then.
it possible that they just thought they finished it but hadn't, and had kind of left it in this half-finished kind of state?
Yeah, or they didn't care about gossip, or gossiping about gossip. I understand that. I can empathize.
That was some really uncomfortable stuff you were showing.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. I've written code that's that bad. Thankfully, this wasn't mine, but still.
But I look at other code, especially code that's not written in Ruby, and so much code that's in production is so bad. It just surprises me that there's so much stuff out there that is so hard to understand and so obscure and obtuse and overly complicated. And what's going on? Why is there so little craftsmanship out there?
I think we're too clever for our own good, and we're in too much of a hurry.
You have crazy hair. See? Now I made you stand up.
Thanks for the presentation, and thanks also for bringing up this issue of when one person sort of looks good while slowing down other people, because I don't think we tend to have the self-awareness of seeing that on our team, perhaps.
I think it's not visible.
But my specific issue is with maybe that person also has a lot of authority on the team, which makes the whole dynamic kind of tough.
Yeah, sometimes if you ask that person, what would happen if everybody on the team did this? And I would not be surprised if the answer was, it would be wonderful. We would get so much done in so little time. I don't know if there's, I don't know if people are always aware of the cost of going quickly. I don't know. I think we all also do it. I don't think that there's one person that commits the bad code and everyone, we all do it at different times. And sometimes there are people who do it more than others, I think.
Please put your hands together for the new world record holder for answering questions, Katrina Owen.
Thank you.